Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the STI Staccato P DUO. The 1911 never went away, and of course when the 2011 was introduced, it never really went away either, even though the design isn't as old as the venerable 1911, which is a firearm that celebrates a great history of use in all manners of personal defense and professional occupation. It was a military sidearm for a very long time, and it's seen use with some of the most high-speed, if you want to use that word, units in military and law enforcement for a very long time. The 2011 basically was intended to improve upon that functionality while introducing a double stack capacity. Now, that being said, the 2011, until recently, never really saw widespread use outside of competition shooting and the occasional person who understood what the system was, understood that that's what they wanted. They wanted a single action only 1911 style trigger, but they wanted that additional capacity, and maybe there's some other features that they were after that they preferred from a 1911 style gun that they couldn't get from a striker fired or your traditional double action, single action guns for double stack capacity for 45, 9mm, 40 cal, what have you. So we're seeing a bit of a renaissance now with the 2011, partially because of STI and even more recently the Staccato P optics ready platform. There were already a number of law enforcement agencies using the Staccato P, and then the Staccato P DUO, and then of course other models of STI or 2011s in general. But the Staccato P DUO really became a little bit more popular, I guess, or a little more relevant, or a little more well known, or shared on social media, if you will, when it was adopted by Marshall's SOG. And that created quite the conversation regarding the 2011 as a platform. Some people are, talking about why would you use outdated technology when guns like the Glock and the 320 and FN and all these other brands exist. But I'm fairly certain that the Marshalls put the Staccato P DUO through probably a rigorous amount of testing before they decided to adopt it, probably more rigorous than I do in this review process. I did 2,000 rounds, which is my standard review process on any firearm, and because this is an optics platform, it comes ready for a Delta Point Pro or with an adapter plate. You also get the Trijicon RMR. I wanted to make sure that the adapter system was also going to hold up to long-term use and not create any issues with retaining zero in the event that the handgun suffered a little bit of hard use. As far as ammunition goes for the view process, I shot 115 Fiocchi, also some 115 S&B, 124 grain Gecko, and 124 grain Gold Dot plus P and traditional 124 grain Gold Dot. And that's the ammunition I put through the 2,000 rounds for the Staccato P DUO. My initial impressions were, well, it's probably no secret, I'm not a huge fan of the 1911. Not because I don't appreciate it for what it is, it's just it's a very old design. I mean, it's in the name, 1911, and filming of this video, it's 2019. So it's a design that's been around for well over a century at this point. While it still sees widespread use, and improvements have certainly been made in manufacturing, quality control, and some of the internals in order to feed more modern ammunitions. I've always considered the 1911, and of course speaking from experience of actually having to carry one professionally for a time, a secondary weapon only that's going to provide you with a great deal of accuracy and a great deal of reliability if the gun is maintained sometimes to almost an unrealistic level of weapons maintenance having to be done prior to use. The 2011, at least on initial inspection, was basically a 1911 that had more bullets in it, which is not necessarily the truth depending on who you're getting the gun from. This is the first STI I've ever owned. I have shot them in the past. This is also the first 2011 I've ever owned, even though I've shot those in the past as well. And as far as the review process goes, I was keeping my own personal biases locked up in a box so I could just view the firearm on its merits and not bring in any of my own personal feelings about the platform in general. So that's what you're getting out of this review. Getting specifically into the features, what sets the Staccato P DUO apart from other 2011s that are out there or other service guns that you might choose or carry guns that you might choose? Well, just talking about the firearm's features in general, we've got a 4.15 inch bull barrel. I prefer the bull barrel over a bushing barrel for a lot of reasons. I've owned 1911s in the past when they experienced extreme heat temperature changes from hot to cold, cold to hot. I could actually crack and shatter that bushing when firing the gun. And the bull barrel to me tends to provide a greater deal of accuracy longer as the gun heats up. It's got a diamond-like carbon finish, gives you that black color. As far as magazines go, like I said, it's a double stack this particular one, double stack 9mm, and there's a bunch of different magazines available. It comes with a 17 and a 20 round mag, but there's also larger capacity magazines beyond that. And STI just recently released, I should say, their Generation 2 2011 magazine, which is much improved over the past. I've seen and talked to people in the past with 2011s where they'd buy 5 or 6 or 10 magazines and maybe 6 or 7 of them would feed reliably. And kind of gone are the days of having to send your magazines off to have them tuned or tuning them yourself if you possess that skill set. The trigger is 4.5 pounds, which is a little heavier than what some people might want out of a 1911, but keep in mind this firearm's design primarily is intended for carrier duty, so a 4.5 pound trigger, ambidextrous safeties, I think is a very good trigger weight for a duty carry gun. It comes with Dawson precision sights. They call it the precision purpose impact. So you've got a fiber optic front, you've got a full blacked out rear, which is my preferred setup. Some people might be a little apprehensive to have that on an optic gun because they feel like the front fiber is going to distract from the dot. But remember, with a red dot pistol, we focus on the target. The only time we focus on that front sight is when we're using the front sights. I have other fiber guns that have red dots on them. In fact, I've got one that the front sight is a red fiber, and it doesn't distract at all from the red dot because my brain can tell the difference, and I'm staying target focused. Grip is the STI's frame tree bark stipple. It's full length, and it has what I would consider to be like a carry magwell, carry bevel, so you've got a little bit of a funnel there for assistance in feeding magazines, which actually works really, really well. I was pretty happy with the performance on that. A lot of the hard edges has been radius down, and you've got front and rear cocking serrations. So at a glance, it's got everything that you would want in a carry or duty gun without getting into the ridiculous nature of some things that you see in modifications for firearms. The safety is ambi stock, which I do appreciate. Not only is that important for people who are left or right-handed, me being primarily a left-handed handgun shooter, an ambi 1911 or 2011 is kind of I have to have it. But think about it from a duty or a carry perspective. If I have to transfer that firearm over to my support side hand for whatever reason, even if you're right-handed, now you're transferring that gun onto your left hand, I can still clear the safety and still operate the firearm effectively. And the same is true of left to right, right to left. So I think that's a pretty cool staple feature. Another thing I really appreciate about the ambi safety is it doesn't grind or catch when using the other side. I've owned 1911s in the past that were ambi safety, but the ambi safety was an afterthought. So when I was shooting it left-handed, it was much harder for me to sweep it off based on the way that the two things interfaced. When I shot it right-handed, no problems at all, which is, a pretty common thing. Guns are, for good reason, primarily designed for right-handed shooters. Even to this day, most ambi guns aren't actually set up for left-handed shooters or ambi because the ejection port is still on the right side of the gun, which you don't need to change that, but something us left-handed shooters have to be aware of. It has an internal extractor ejector, which I really, really appreciate. I don't like 1911s that had that external extractor. For just personal preference, personal experiences in the past of those being a little bit more problematic than the internal setup. I touched on it briefly, but I think it deserves its own mention, is the 4.5 pound, what I consider to be a duty weight trigger. That heavy, relatively speaking, of a trigger in a 1911 style trigger is something I never really encountered before, not on purpose. I've shot some really crappily made 1911s that probably had 5-pound triggers, but it wasn't on purpose. This one's with a specific intent. Even though it is a heavier trigger than what some people would like out of a 1911, you can still run the gun fast and effective, and it provides a very reasonable press for more precision shooting if that's what you have to do. So it's not unduly heavy, but it's also not so light that you can outrun the gun. The slide release is slightly recessed into the frame, which initially I wasn't a fan of that. I wanted it to be a little more prominent, a little bit more pronounced, because as a left-handed shooter I manipulate that with my index finger. While shooting the gun right-handed, I kind of understood why it was put there. It's out of the way, but it's still well accessible by most, I can't say all, but most thumb sizes. So if you've got a little bit of reach, you're going to get it, but you're not going to get it inadvertently, and it stays out of your way when you're using a traditional two-handed shooting grip. The magazine release is extended, but it doesn't have a huge surface area that can somehow or sometimes interfere with your grip, because the gun's got to be able to appreciate a bunch of different hand sizes, and it's impossible for designers to really account for every single shooter that's going to carry the gun. So going with this straight cylindrical post I think was a really good idea, but it is threaded, so if you wanted to introduce a larger paddle you could. Of course, first things first. Once I got the optic mounted, I went with the Trijicon RMR because that's my preferred red dot optic for handguns, even though it comes ready for a delta point if that's the optic you're going to choose. Once I got it mounted and zeroed, I went ahead and did my 500 round burn down. 500 rounds accelerated rate of fire as fast as I can feed ammunition through the gun to see if it's going to cause any issues. 500 rounds leisurely is a lot different than 500 rounds as quickly as possible. Usually on a semi-automatic handgun, that 500 rounds takes me about 3.5–4 minutes. So without further ado, here's your burn down. Warm. Aside from the gun getting really hot and melting my front fiber, 500 rounds went through flawlessly, no malfunctions, ammunition, magazine, or firearm related. So as far as the burn down goes, big pass for the Staccato P DUO. Of course, the next thing we need to talk about is accuracy. How accurate is it? Well, here, just real quick, is my 5-round zero confirmation group shot with 124 grain gold dot. That's a 25-yard group, and I'm hard-pressed to be more happy with it. Granted, that group was shot bag supported. I didn't completely vise the gun down, but I did support it with a bag during that zeroing process, which is something I always do. 25 yards shooting a group like that out of under 5-inch 9mm handgun, I don't care what the operation system is, you got to be happy with accuracy like that. Now, because there's an optic mounting system, I want to talk specifically about that. One thing that always appealed to me about the 1911 and 2011, just looking at it, understanding how the internals work on the slide versus some of the other guns that are out there, is how deep you can go. Unfortunately, for some reason, STI chose to include a very thick mounting plate for the optic. Now, the mounting plate itself we'll talk about specifically, but I want to talk about that height. We could have gotten the optic a lot deeper in the slide if they'd gone with a slightly, I'd say even up to half deeper optic mounting plate. Yeah, you'd have to include slightly lower sights, but I don't really feel like that should be a deciding factor in including such a large, thick mounting plate. Now, of course, that's going to add strength to the system because the plate's much thicker, but steel, you could even go with titanium, given what you're going to end up paying MSRP for one of these. And of course, they have their reasons for the plate they chose, and I appreciate that. But from a objective perspective, I want my optic to sit as low in the slide as I can. That's why I'm getting a milled gun. At this point, it's slightly lower than what you'd get from a dovetail system on a comparable handgun, and it actually sits pretty much flush with the overall height of the slide. They could have gone a lot deeper, especially for the delta point, which sits higher than the RMR anyway. Being able to get deeper into that slide would have been, well, should have been something they did. The good news is, if someone wants to do an aftermarket plate, or STI decides to do a smaller plate, which I do understand that they do have a slightly shorter one. It's still not probably as short as I would want it to be, but it does exist, using different front and rear sights for that purpose. They can do it. Like you can go pretty deep with this particular system, just based on how deep the actual footprint is for the optic mounting system. Of course, that aside, how efficient or how good or how reliable is the optic plate? Something people generally, and wisely so, worry about is, if I'm introducing a plate in between my optic and my firearm, is that plate going to be a weak point or a point of failure? In some system it is. With Staccato P DUO, I wanted to check that. So I did, just like I would with an optic, but I'm doing it specifically for the optic mounting platform, is I did a periodic drop test during the 2,000 round review process. About every 500 rounds, I did a full shoulder height drop on the optic to see if the plate would fail in any way. It wasn't a concern that I had. I didn't think it would, but it's something that I wanted to check. So that's exactly what I did. Now, one of the more controversial things I do in my review process is drop testing, especially for pistol optics. Some guys don't like the fact, they think it's unrealistic because, oh, you know, you're not going to drop your gun from shoulder height. And maybe they're right, hopefully they're right, but shoulder height exists. It's a common height for weapons to be held from. But more than that, what I'm really doing is adding a lot of force to the optic, or the optic mounting platform, or what I'm particularly testing, to account for force that can be delivered in other ways, such as rolling on your holster, especially if we're talking about duty use for a handgun. If you get into a ground fight with a guy and you're rolling around in your gun, is that ground fight going to break your optic, or potentially cause a shift or a breakage on the screws that hold your optic mounting plate? So this is something I definitely want to worry about. And with the Staccato P DUO, your rear sights are attached to that plate. So if the plate fails, or God forbid shears off, now all you have is a front sight. So I did my periodic 4 drop test from shoulder height. I'm sure that caused some cringing, those 4 shoulder height drop tests on a 2011 that has a price point like this. But I didn't buy it to baby it, I bought it to review it. So I'm not going to baby it just because of the actual cost, which is something we'll talk about a little later. Here's a 5-round group fired after that 4th drop. I was fired on 124 grain gold dot, the same 5 rounds I fired for that 0 confirmation group I showed you a little earlier. Returned to 0, never left 0, I should say. So as far as the optic plate goes, I believe that their interface, their locking tabs, and their linear recoil lug, if you will, and the screw depth and everything is giving you a really solid plate, and it's a really thick piece of metal. So that's a factor as well. You definitely want a more robust optic mounting plate that wasn't put on the gun as an afterthought, which I really appreciate. I wish it was a little bit thinner, like I said, let the optics sit a little bit deeper in the gun, but as it stands, I can't complain whatsoever with the design and the intent of their optic mounting plate. Impressions of the Staccato P DUO over the 2,000 rounds. I used it, I worked it both from concealment and from duty carry, just in my own practice and what I was working on at the time. It's a solid, fine-tuned, reliable firearm. Throughout the 2,000 round review process, I only had 1 malfunction, and that was ammunition related. I didn't have any issues whatsoever with the magazines, which I think is important, or with the actual operating system of the 2011. Now, these do generally require a, relatively speaking, higher level of maintenance than what you're going to get away with some of the other semi-automatic handguns that are out there, like Glock, 320, SIG, whatever. So you need to make sure you pay attention to the round count on your springs. You need to make sure you keep it oiled. Beyond that, and I didn't do either of those things during the review process. Of course, I'm going to now that I've finished my 2,000 rounds. I'm going to keep running it to see how it goes. But during that 2,000 rounds, I ran it pretty hard. I didn't go completely unrealistic with it, but I was shooting 500 to 1,000 rounds per 8-hour range trip whenever I'd go to the range with it. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. I also took it on the road with me to some of my classes, let students shoot it, and I also shot it during some of the demonstrations I would do in those classes. I'm very, very happy with the performance of the Staccato P DUO. Now, as much as I wanted to keep my own personal feelings about 1911 out of it, they were always kind of in the back of my head. I don't hate the 1911, and I want 1911s to be good, but my sample size and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of students over the last 10 years, and even longer seeing 1911s in my career of 20 years, I know that you have to buy the right 1911 or you have to buy the right 2011 to get something that's going to function reliably in all the conditions you could possibly expect. One concern, and I wasn't really able to kind of check this, but I think it's something that's definitely worth mentioning, is I've seen it happen with 1911s and 2011s in the past, is if not properly lubricated, working in very cold environments, they can be really finicky. Unfortunately, this review process took place during the summer in Georgia, so cold weather wasn't something I got my hands on. Other than that, I can't really say anything even remotely negative about the way the Staccato P DUO performed. It's a very accurate, very intuitive gun. Kind of had to remind myself a little bit at the start, you know, those particulars that 1911s and 2011s have, being able to work that safety and then changing your grip ever so slightly to ride that safety while you're shooting to give yourself the most rigid grip possible. But once I kind of got used to shooting 1911s again, the Staccato P DUO was easy, intuitive, and effective to shoot. Last thing we got to talk about is cost. Depending on where you look, MSRP is right around $2,500. I've seen them on Gunbroker and some of the other sites for a little more or less for retail sales. So you're looking respectively at a $2,500 handgun. You can't think of a 2011 and you can't think of this gun as you would a Glock or a 320 or an FN or any of your more common duty or carry guns that you see out there. If you're willing to spend $2,500 on a quality AR, then you should have no problem spending $2,500 on a quality 2011. And I'm saying this with all honesty, if I wasn't going to review this gun, I wouldn't have bought it. But I'm glad that I did, because it helps me understand why it costs what it costs. And the argument can be made, and I'm sure it's going to be made in the comments, that you can get just as good for less, and I would challenge you to prove that. Just saying it's not enough, I'm going to need to see proof. I've shot and seen $1,000 2011s in classes, and they performed horribly. And that may have been an operator issue. Of course, I have no control over what maintenance was done on that gun, but I saw the gun perform badly. I saw remedial actions take place, such as oiling and changing springs, and the gun still performed terribly. Some of your cheaper 1911s, when you get on the trigger pull, it's kind of like pulling a center block through gravel. It's going to get there, it's just you're going to have to fight for it. That's not something I experienced with this particular gun. I'm definitely glad that I got one, because it shows me, like, okay, with that price point, what am I really paying for? Well, you're paying for the engineering, you're paying for the gunsmithing. A little bit's probably paying for the branding and the name, but I think most of the value is in the materials that are used and the precision that went into the quality control of mating the 2011 frame to the 2011 slide, and making sure everything functioned as it should. And because this is a gun that's more geared towards duty and professional carry and personal defense carry, I think, I can't say for certain, but I would be willing to bet that even more attention went into the parts that were chosen and the way things that are going to work together as far as quality control. There are no loose tolerances in this gun. However, it did not give me that break-in period I've seen and experienced myself on really high-end 1911s and 2011s. I mean, as far as 1911s go, the only 1911 major brand I have not owned is SIG and probably Rock River. I've owned Wilson Combats, I've owned STIs, I've owned Nighthawks. I've owned Ed Brown's, Les Bowers, pretty much everything back in the day when I was still a 1911 aficionado. So I understand what a good 1911 and what a good 2011 is compared to. Granted, this is my first 2011, but like I said, I had a lot of experience with them with students and other people I know that have them, and I have shot them. I mean, this isn't my first time picking one up by any means. So I get it. And actually, this point was brought up by Jared Russin. He said, you know, if you're willing to spend that money on a quality AR, why wouldn't you spend that money on a quality sidearm? Of course, he was speaking more from a duty carry as a secondary weapon perspective for SWAT or other purposes. But I think it rings very, very true. If you don't want a 2011, then I don't really understand why the conversation would even take place. If you are looking for a 2011, you should definitely give the Staccato P DUO a look. I'm Eric Allen with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.